Chapter 7, the labor process and the valorization process. Kind of like the David Harvey video. I think I'll try and spend most of the time on chapter 7. Because chapter 8 and 9 are. Like, 8 is. You could practically skim it and just get to the. I'll probably just cut to the chase about, like, okay, this is constant capital, this is variable capital. Okay, moving right along. Because it's basically just definitions. And then similarly to chapter 9, it's kind of just walking through some pretty simple formulas. At least I found them simple. I guess if we get hung up, obviously save your questions when we get there, but it's not like super in depth. Chapter 7, I think, is the most in depth of these three, and I think the most interesting. So, anyways, with that said, let's jump in here. Right. So yeah, labor is first of all a process between man and nature, a process by which man, through his own actions, mediates, regulates, and controls the metabolism between himself and nature. So there's that mention of metabolism again, which is cool. Again, it's sort of like this. Marx is taking like an ecological perspective at labor in this particular chapter. And he does basically say that he's going to tackle it slightly above the what he calls like the animal level. So it's not like instinctive forms of labor, although I think you could say that like instinctive forms of labor are kind of like a subcategory of labor in the broadest umbrella, but we're not going to look at that right now. So in other words, like a cow that like grazes on grass, that's technically labor. It's burning calories to do that. But that's not what we're interested in, at least. He's going to say that we're going to look at labor, which is an exclusively human characteristic. So he gives a few examples here, like the cow, I guess, Jay. Like spiders make webs and bees make honeycombs, which is cool. But he says that the difference here between the worst architect from the best bee is that the architect builds the cells in his mind before constructing it in wax. So sort of showing that what he thinks, and I'm actually kind of curious because I don't know much about it, but I'd be curious to see like if there's any cognitive animal behavior like research has been done on this type of stuff. Like how creative are animals capable of being? I think that's kind of an interesting question actually. But Marx is at least suggesting here that animals are not particularly creative. They kind of just go along with their instincts that are built in their brains, so to speak. And so basically, the bee, I don't know what a bee is thinking necessarily, but I guess what he's insinuating is that the bee kind of is just doing things without much rhyme or reason. Again, just kind of following a pre-written script, if you think of it that way. Whereas a human is sort of is confronted with some problem in the world, right? So the human needs water, or maybe need to carry water from point A to point B. Now they could do this with their hands and just like make a little cup maybe with their hands, and okay, that might get a little bit of water from point A to point B, but it's not very efficient. It's not very. In fact, you might spill most of it through your fingers. I'm not sure, but so the human might visualize a better version of the cup, maybe one made of wood, and they'll carve it, and then they'll go and test it and be like, hey, this thing does hold water. That's great. Now I've made a vessel and I can use it to carry water around. That's kind of an example of like that more that's what Marx is calling like the kind of human form of labor, where there's like a mental aspect to it and a physical aspect to it. And I don't think he even mentions it in this chapter, but if anyone ever runs into the cringe and not correct distinction between mental and physical labor, which I know exists, like people think it's a thing where they're like, oh, there's jobs where it's like mostly physical, and jobs where it's mostly mental labor. All labor is somewhat mental and somewhat physical, because you need your body to do literally anything, and your body needs your brain to do literally anything. So your body and your brain are not necessarily separate entities. It's just like a question of the ratio, if you want to, like, how much energy goes to just thinking versus doing. But anyways, it's a silly distinction. I wouldn't bog down in it too much. But yeah, that's what we want to focus on. But like I said, I think that sort of establishing labor as like this ecological activity that all organisms take part in order to survive is a cool perspective on it. Which also means that a lot of things can fall under the umbrella of labor, under this definition. In fact, pretty much almost anything you do that isn't like sleeping, or, I mean, I guess you could. I think we actually will get to the part where he talks about like the consumption of the means of subsistence is like, I'm not going to mix up terms, because there's like productive consumption and like consumptive production or something. I think productive consumption is like eating, because you're like refueling yourself as a machine that does labor or something like that. Anyways, basically, if you're not sleeping, you're probably doing labor. So let's put it that way. Okay. Next couple important elements that we want to keep in mind here. Number one, purposeful activity. That is the work itself. Purposeful being the key word there. Number two, the object on which that work is performed, or objects. It could be multiple things. But these are like the physical components that you are working with. Then number three is the instruments of that work. So this is all the tools and basically products of previous labor that you're working. Okay. So he does mention land here a bit, saying that it's like the universal material. We need somewhere to work, basically. Now, I mean, we can also imagine, we don't need to imagine that much, I guess, but you could also do work on, for example, like International Space Station or any type of space station. You could potentially do work there as well. But we would just then say, well, the space station is just another means of production. Right? It's just like, that is the where. It just doesn't happen to be literal land. Same thing, I guess, if you were doing work on a boat. You're not literally on land, but you're on a piece of equipment that allows you to do work. Let's just think of it that way. Okay. Let's see. Let's keep going. Like another useful definition here to keep in mind as we go forward. So he says, like, Marx's definition of raw material is the objects of labor that have been filtered through previous labor. Call it raw material. And all raw material is an object of labor, but not every object of labor is raw material. So if you're using some objects to make a new object, and the things you're using were collected or harvested or made by somebody else, in a previous labor process, that's what we call raw material. So just kind of keep that in mind every time it's mentioned. I guess the last part here is a good summary. The object of labor counts as raw material only when it has undergone some alteration by means of labor. There you go. Sorry, just checking something real fast. Okay. Next, we have the definition of for an instrument of labor is a thing or a complex of things the worker interposes between himself and the object of his labor, and which serves as a conductor directing his activity onto the object. It's a kind of a long way of saying it's a tool. And yeah, that's not too hard. Right, he talks here about like, you know, our original tools are our bodily organs. And actually, I remember I was reading the Marks in the Earth. It's a book by John Bellamy Foster, and in that book they actually go into sort of like the original meaning of organ, and it basically has the same meaning as tool. Organ and tool are kind of interchangeable in this context. So our bodily organs are indeed our bodily tools, which are the first ones we ever used, and then we use those to make new tools, and the process has continued to this day where we still use tools to make new tools and so on and so forth. That is basically the story of technological development. Let's see. So yeah, he says domesticated animals could be instruments because they help us do some basic labor like carrying stuff around or doing plowing or something like that. Oh yeah, here this is where he's quoting this Franklin guy. I don't even know who this is, but yeah, the classic, humans as tool making animals. Obviously, we know that we're not the only animals that make tools. There are some other chimps and stuff that do that. But yeah, that's also something humans
I'm pretty
do.
sure that he was Franklin refers to Benjamin Franklin, if I'm not mistaken.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I don't know if there's like a unless one of these citations is Benjamin Franklin. I just don't like this one. I don't know. No, that's Turgot. Yeah, I don't know which Franklin, but Benjamin Franklin would be interesting. So it would make. Okay. Let's see. Let's keep going through some definitions. Sorry, I'm just my notes really fast. 287. Yeah, I guess I didn't have too many notes for the next few pages. Some of this is just getting some basic stuff out of the way about like the fundamental, like what raw materials are. And he's also talking about a little bit in here about how we're using the raw materials for their use values because we want to kind of either make production possible or we add that use value to the new product. That's sort of what he's getting at. Oh, yeah. This is what I'm looking for. Whenever products enter as means of production into new labor processes, they lose their character of being products and function only as objective factors contributing to labor. So that's just what that means. Basically, is well, this I think is specifically when you make a means of production or making a tool. They aren't basically as soon as they become a means of production, It's not a tool that you buy at the store anymore. It is now a factor that living labor uses as a tool, right? Because I can go to the store and like buy a screwdriver, right? And in the store, um, it has a character of being a product to me. But as soon as I, take that screwdriver and go use it to make something, now it's a means of production because I'm using it to produce something. Pretty straightforward, hopefully, nothing too crazy. What else? Oh yeah, this is the part I was hinting at about the Marx is calling labor a process of consumption, and he calls it productive consumption. Um, I might have gotten this mixed up with the means of subsistence, so just that I guess. What he says that it's distinguished from individual consumption by this. Oh, okay, individual consumption I guess would be stuff. The latter uses up products as means of subsistence for the living individual. So individual consumption is like eating and watching TV, I guess, and showering, doing hygiene stuff. The former as means of subsistence for labor, specifically the activity through which the living individual's labor power manifests itself. Thus, the product of individual consumption is the consumer himself. The result of productive consumption is a product distinct from the consumer. So, individual consumption is like when we talk about like the consumer as individuals going to like a store, we buy stuff, we take it home, we consume it. That would fall into the category of individual consumption. Whereas if you go to work and you use, I don't know, some cloth, some thread, and a needle to sew a shirt or something, the cloth and the thread have been consumed to become a shirt, because now the shirt just means cloth plus thread in a certain shape that a human can wear. Right? That's just what the definition of a shirt is, basically. But we also wouldn't separate the thread and the cloth, and we wouldn't say like, "Hey, nice thread plus cloth you're wearing." Right? It's like it's a shirt. The thread and the cloth don't really. They're not independent any longer. They are combined into a completely new product. It's its own name and own distinct form. Okay. C290. Yeah, let's jump to right here. Actually, one more thing before we get there. So, this is sort of a quick conclusion on the labor process part. So, this is an interesting point there where Marx is basically saying that labor is a universal condition for the metabolic interaction between man and nature, the everlasting nature-imposed condition of human existence. It is therefore independent of every form of that existence, or rather, it is common to all forms of society in which human beings live. So, indeed, he is positing that as human beings, we are basically condemned, if you want to think of it that way, to an existence of at least some labor. Right? We have to do a little bit of labor, at the very least, in order to just live. Part of our deal as living organisms, I think one of the definitions of life, I know there's like a few, like a 3 or 4 point bullet list on like, okay, these are the qualifications for being a living thing. One of them is, obtaining energy and or materials from your environment in order to replenish yourself. And that falls under the category of labor. So, yes, there will be labor under socialism. Yes, there will be labor under communism. It will probably be labor till the end of time. But the great struggle of, you know, hopefully future communist societies will be to shorten the amount of labor that we need to do in order to have fulfilling lives to a bare minimum, such that we can use the rest of our time doing fun stuff that isn't productive. Okay, now, so that's sort of wrapping up the labor section. But now we want to take a look at our Mr. Capitalist here. So he says, let's return to the capitalist. We left him just after he had purchased in the open market all the necessary factors of the labor process, which are the means of production and labor power. With the keen eye of an expert, he has selected the means of production and the kind of labor power best adapted to his particular trade, which can be spinning, boot making, etc. He then proceeds to consume the commodity, that being labor power, that he just bought. And he causes the worker, who is the bearer of the power, labor power, to consume the means of production by his labor. Remember that productive consumption. The general character of the labor process is evidently not changed by the fact that the worker works for a capitalist instead of himself. Moreover, the particular methods and operations employed in bootmaking or spinning are not immediately altered by the intervention of the capitalist. Right? Whether I make boots at home by myself, versus doing it in a workshop for my boss, it's still bootmaking. That doesn't change. I must begin by taking the labor power as he finds it in the market. Consequently, he must be satisfied with the kind of labor which arose in the period when there were as yet no capitalists. The transformation of the mode of production itself, which results from the subordination of labor to capital, can only occur later on, and we shall therefore deal with it in a later chapter. Putting that off for now. So let's get to the consequences of labor now, because human beings do labor, period, regardless of what's going on. But now we're going to look at a situation where, specifically, the laborers, the workers, are doing labor for a capitalist. Let's take a look at that. So first of all, when you sell your labor power to the capitalist controls the work that happens during that time period. They have a say over what happens and what you're doing. Now, I'm sure everyone's sort of familiar, if you have a boss, that you can have varying degrees of intensiveness on this front, right? Your boss might be like super micromanaging, and they're trying to make sure that like every second of your day is doing exactly what they want you to do, which can be incredibly irritating. Or they can be a little more lax and they kind of just don't give a fuck. As long as you get your shit done by the end of the day, that's also really all they're looking for. And yeah, I think but generally speaking, the laws in the capital society and sort of the contract that you're entering when you sell your labor power is that they get to say what happened during the period that you sold labor power for. So yeah, they also don't want to make sure it's not wasted. You don't waste stuff. But if you do waste stuff, that would be kind of based, so consider it. He says, next consequence. Secondly, the product is the property of the capitalist and not that of the worker, immediate producer. Suppose that a capitalist pays for a day's worth of labor power, and then then the right to use that power for a day belongs to him, just as much as the right of use of any commodity. The use of that commodity belongs to its purchaser, and the seller of labor power, giving his labor, does no more in reality than part with the use value he has just sold. From the instant he steps into the workshop, the use value of his labor power, therefore its use, which is labor, belongs to the capitalist. The capitalist incorporates labor as a living agent of fermentation into the lifeless constituents of the product, which also belong to him. From his point of view, the labor process is nothing more than the consumption of the commodities purchased, meaning labor power. But he can consume this labor power only by adding the means of production to it. The labor process is a process between things that the capitalist has purchased, things which belong to him. Thus, the product of this process belongs to him just as much as the wine, which is the product of the process of fermentation going on in his cellar. So, pretty simple deduction there, right? If I'm the capitalist and I buy all these means of production, and I also buy you, or I should say your labor output for the next 8 hours, which is just another commodity, then the products of me using my commodities, which ironically is more like you using them because you're the worker, also belong to me because I bought them. I'm using them to make something, and therefore whatever is made also belongs to the capitalist. No, not too complicated. I think everyone's pretty familiar with that. Good old private property stuff. So next we have, okay, part 2 is the valorization process. So we talked about the labor process. Hopefully nothing too complicated. It's pretty straightforward. I don't know how old everyone is, but I assume most of you are at least familiar with how jobs work, which means none of this should be like totally brand new to any of us, hopefully. Anyways, the next part is a little more, perhaps you might say, like behind the curtain, so to speak. Something that a lot of workers may not directly encounter on a day-to-day basis. This is a little bit more going on the capitalist's end of things. So, all right. So he starts out by saying the product is a use value, and that they are produced by capitalists only because, and insofar as they form the material substratum of exchange value. So this is pretty much just a callback to some of the first 2 chapters where we're making the distinction between use value and exchange value. And we realize that one of the relationships between the two, as far as they're both aspects of a commodity, because remember, a commodity is a use value and it is also an exchange value. The only reason a capitalist would even make a use value is in order to sell it to someone else. Right? The capitalist doesn't need that shit. Like, he's like, that would not be, you wouldn't even be a capitalist at that point. But yeah, they have 2 objectives, right? In the first place, he wants to produce a use value which has an exchange value. So that's just a commodity. Okay, cool. That's step 1. Secondly, he wants to produce a commodity greater in value than the sum of the values of the commodities used to produce it, namely the means of production and the labor power he purchased with his good money on the open market. These are the 2 objectives, right? And it's sort of like saying, it's sort of like the first objective is basically makes exchange possible. It has to be exchangeable, meaning it has an exchange value and you can exchange it for other commodities. But it also has to have a use value such that other people will actually exchange you for it. That's step 1. But then step 2 is that we're not trying to break even here, because that'd be a shitty business move. You'd be a shitty capitalist and you wouldn't be in business for very long. We're trying to make more money than we started with, right? Recall the M to C to M prime circuit of capital. That's what we're trying to do here. And he summarizes this by saying that we're not just making use values, we're making commodities. And we're not just making value, but we're trying to produce a surplus value. That's at the end of the day, that's what we're trying to do. So he says, okay, we're going to get into that. How do you create value? Which again, recall from I think last week's chapters where we get into the general formula of capital. Recall that the process of going from M to M prime is called valorization. That's Marx's terminology. So ultimately, when we talk about the valorization process, we're saying, how do you get from M to M prime? Okay. So that's the question. And we already know from those earlier chapters also that Marx teased us by saying he's pretty sure the answer lies in the productive arena. And now we use the first part of the chapter to look at, okay, what are the components of production? It's labor and means of production. Okay, pretty straightforward, but it doesn't actually answer how we're getting more money. So now we're about to get there. Okay. So he says, we know that the value of each commodity is determined by the quantity of labor materialized in its use value, by the labor time socially necessary to produce it. Just quickly reiterating the definition of value. This rule also holds good in the case of the product handed over to the capitalist as a result of the labor process. Assuming this product to be yarn, our first step is to calculate the quantity of labor objectified in it. Okay, so I guess I'll highlight this sentence because it is rather important. So he says, this rule also holds good in the case of the product handed to the capitalist as a result of the labor process. So he's, again, kind of teasing the answer now. In a way, this is kind of the hypothesis. And then he's going to walk through a thought experiment here with some yarn and, come around back to his hypothesis, which basically says, well, if value is socially necessary labor time and the labor process is a person, the worker, doing labor to a bunch of commodities, well, that labor also has to be tallied and counted as socially necessary labor. So get there. And if we keep track of that, then we should have more labor on the other end than we started. So he starts out by saying, he just says, okay, we don't really care why or how, but the cotton's worth 10 shillings. Cool. Next, there's some wear and tear on the spindle, which is the instrument of production in this case. He says, let's just call that 2 shillings, right? Because this is just basic second law of thermodynamics. Everything breaks down and gets destroyed eventually. Yay, entropy. So being a reasonable capitalist, you would build that into your cost of production. Next, okay, so he's saying, okay, there's 12 shillings in the yarn. Cool. I don't know. I sometimes skim through the examples during these presentations because they're a little tedious, but let me skip to the meat and past the meat and potatoes, I guess. Get straight to the gravy. It's a quick, I guess, important part, because we'll get into this a little more in, I guess, later on in the chapter. So he says that all the labor contained in the yarn is past labor, and it is a matter of no importance that the labor expended to produce its constituent elements lies further back in the past than labor expended on the final process, which is the spinning. So this is, again, setting up the argument that labor done during the labor process, it doesn't really matter when the labor was done in order to count as a value, right? So if I use like an antique hammer to build something out of wood or something, even if that hammer was made, 50 some odd years ago and was just sitting around since then, it's still a value because someone still spent time making it. And I guess I'm sort of assuming this hammer has not degraded in any way, as most tools do, and he talks about that as well. But let's just say it's like a brand new, very very well preserved hammer, no rust or anything like that. Basically, it doesn't really. He's saying that it doesn't really matter when things were made in order to have value. So that's cool. So let's go here then. Two conditions must be fulfilled. First, the cotton and the spindle must genuinely have served to produce a use value. They must be, in the present case, become yarn. Value is independent of the particular use value which it is born, but a use value of some kind has to act of its bearer. Second, the labor time expended must not exceed what is necessary under the given social conditions of production, and therefore, if no more than 1 pound of cotton is needed to spend 1 pound of yarn, no more than this weight of cotton may be consumed in the production of 1 pound of yarn. So we're assuming there's no shenanigans going on in the production process that wastes a tremendous amount of cotton or something. Okay. Okay, let's get here. We now have to consider this labor from a standpoint quite different from that adopted for the labor process. There, we viewed it solely as the activity which has the purpose of changing cotton into yarn. Therefore, the more appropriate the work was to its purpose, the better the yarn, under circumstances remaining the same. In the case of the labor of the spinner was specific. In that case, the labor of the spinner was specifically different from other kinds of productive labor, and this difference revealed itself both subjectively and in the purpose of spinning, and objectively in the special character of his operations. He said, I'll skip ahead just a little bit. Here, on the contrary, where we consider the labor of the spinner only insofar as it creates value, i.e. is a source of value, that labor differs in no respect from the labor of the man who bores a cannon or the cotton planter or spindle maker or blah, blah, blah. It is solely by reason of this identity that cotton planting, blah, 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 namely the value of the yarn. So we're adding up all this previous labor, differing only quantitatively from each other. And here we no longer concerned with the quality, the character, and the content of labor, but merely with its quantity, which, remember, we measure by duration. And he does. I don't remember if we've gone over this yet in previous chapters. If we did, I think I skimmed over it. But the whole simple labor, like average labor of society thing, it's not like that much of a groundbreaking assumption with the whole simple labor. But anyways, I think that's at the end of chapter 7, so we'll come back to that in a second. All right. I want to skip a little bit here because I think he does a little bit of. Okay, yeah. Let's jump to 290. Where's the start of? Yeah, okay. He produced in order to sell it. So this is where this section is pretty fun because Marx is kind of imitating this dialogue with the quote unquote like would be capitalist. And he's sort of portraying their perspective versus the workers' perspective, or like Marx's perspective, basically. So he says that the capitalist becomes assistant. He says the yarn is no use to him. Indeed, he produced it in order to sell it, not to use it. In that case, let him sell it, or easier still, let him in future produce only things that he needs himself. A remedy already prescribed by his personal physician, McCulloch, as being of proven efficacy against the epidemic of overproduction. That's kind of a funny little teaser of future chapters where we will get into crises of overproduction. But I don't know. Fun little joke, I guess, from Marx, where he's basically saying, gee, if only we had a simple remedy for crises of overproduction. Cough, cough, socialism. That's, anyways. So that joke pisses the capitalist off. He becomes defiant. And the capitalist says, can the worker produce commodities out of nothing, merely by using his arms and legs? Did I not provide him with the materials through which and which alone his labor could be embodied? And as the greater part of society consists of such impecunious creatures, have I not rendered society an incalculable service by providing my instruments of production, my cotton, my spindle, and the worker too? For have I not provided him with the means of subsistence? Am I to be allowed in nothing in return for all this service? Am I not merciful? That's basically this. That's basically what this passage is about. It's pretty funny to me because, gosh, haven't we heard this shit before? It's
Sure, I heard that on YouTube sometime today.
Yeah. Gosh. Marx is making fun of it back then, but he might be sad that this shit still happens on a daily basis.
No escape.
Yep. It's the whole, like,
The
I own
crying
everything.
capitalist.
I must, and I give you, time to use my machines to allow you to survive. Aren't I merciful? It's like, no, you're a fucking asshole.
To be fair, the crying capitalist genre does warm one's heart a little bit.
Yeah. It's also very similar to the extremely frustrating landlord argument of but
Hey,
I'm
accept all
providing
the
them I'm
risk.
providing people with housing. That's a good thing. Like, motherfucker, you bought it off the market and denied it from them. That's not providing. That's fucking predatory.
You're fucking scalping the housing, not providing it.
Oh, that's, man, I never even like
We're not
thought about
merciful, and
comparing.
neither are we. Now face the wall.
That's a good comparison though. Like, landlording is literally scalping. Like, there's
Yeah,
if
no,
you
it
basically talk to
absolutely is.
someone who's like really pissed off at scalping, because I think everyone hates scalping, like, by default.
Well, yeah.
But you'd be like, you realize landlords are literally scalpers, but for one of the most essential things to survive, shelter.
And then watch them do a 180 and defend it.
And they will.
Yeah.
They will do insane
To the hill.
Olympics-worthy gymnastics in order to justify being monsters.
But then you have to be like, no, you gotta look in the mirror and basically say, it's me, I'm the problem, it's me.
Yeah, but that moment never comes for a lot of them.
No, but, that's what they were saying about scalpers in Congress a few weeks ago, so I figured I'd, make the joke.
Yep. Marx's punchline here is that in any case, here the question of service does not even arise. So, yeah, he's basically saying, no, you fucking idiot, you're not helping anyone.
As a matter of fact, they're getting in the way.
Yep. So he continues this conversation. He says, our friend who has up till now displayed all the arrogance of capital suddenly takes on the unassuming demeanor of one of his own workers and exclaims, have I myself not worked? Have I not performed the labor of superintendence, of overseeing the spinner? And does not his labor too create value? Or this labor too? The capital's own overseer and manager shrugs their shoulders, which is funny. Because Marx is immediately making fun of him by saying, I know you don't do that fucking shit yourself. You hire middle management to do that for you, dumbass. So, anyways, and he, again, the punchline sort of, he himself does not care two pence for it. He doesn't give a shit. And he leaves this and all similar subterfuge and conjuring tricks to the professors of political economy who are paid for it. Another eater of a punchline. Basically saying that, like, you know, the reason all the political economists wrote this hokey bullshit trying to justify capitalism is because they're paid to, and they benefit directly from doing so. And this is also kind of mirroring that Lenin quote where Lenin's like, you know, like what is it, like freedom of the press is like the freedom for capitalists to buy off like publications, right? If someone can find that quote, like throw it in the chat, I'll read it. But I think y'all know what I'm referring to. But Marx is kind of saying the same shit, right? Basically saying that, like, capitalists don't even typically, this dialogue doesn't even really happen. The capitalists are more content to just like buy off publications, and just make them spew propaganda for them. They don't even bother defending themselves because they know it's pretty indefensible. But not to mention, not just buying off the media, by the way, but also professors of political economy, right? He's like, they just pay the fucking professors to come up with bullshit explanations for why they're not exploiting everyone. Anyways, all right, next section is also very, very good. So I guess we can take our time with it. Okay, so he says let's go in a little more depth. We've had our fun making fun of the capitalists and their silly justifications, but we do want to look at it a little bit more here. So, okay, he said the value of the day's labor power was 3 shillings because our assumption, because on our assumption, half a day's labor is objectified in the quantity of labor power, which means that the subsistence required for every day for the production of labor power costs half a day's labor. But past labor embodied in the labor power and the living labor it can perform, and the daily cost of maintaining labor power in its daily expenditure of work are 2 totally different things. The former determines the exchange value of the labor power, and the latter is its use value. And the fact that half a day's labor is necessary to keep the worker alive during 24 hours does not in any way prevent him from working a whole day. Therefore, the value of labor power and the value which that labor power valorizes in the labor process are 2 entirely different magnitudes. Let's pause there for a second. So he basically says that we were working on an assumption here that labor gets paid exactly what they produce, right? That, like, if you pay your worker 3 shillings for the day, they produce 3 shillings of work. But Marx is saying that assumption doesn't hold water, because recall that the value of any commodity, including labor power, is the socially necessary labor time required to produce it. Now, he says, like, for example, let's say it takes half a day's labor to reproduce labor power, and therefore that's how much it costs the capitalists to pay for it. But with that much, when you reproduce a worker for a day's work, the day is 24 hours long. And I think it's not explicitly said here, and I know he gets into this a little bit later, but well, actually, that might be in chapter 10. When we get to working day, but we'll get there. But, like, I think he's assuming a working day is like 12 hours. and that half day is 6 hours. So let's just say like it takes 6 hours of work to get paid to feed yourself enough that you can come back the next day and keep working. But if you're able to feed yourself for 24 hours, why there's nothing really stopping you from working 12 hours, even though you only get paid for 6 hours. That's what he means by the two different quantities here, is that the exchange value is the cost of reproducing a worker, but the worker, the labor power that the worker uses to do stuff, remember, using your labor power is just doing labor. The labor that does stuff actually produces new value, creates value. So basically, a portion of the labor is being paid for, and a portion is not being paid for. So that is sort of one of the conclusion that we're getting to here. Actually, let me go back. What was really decisive for him was the specific use value which this commodity possesses of being a source of not only value, but of more value than it has itself. This is the specific service the capitalist expects from labor power. In the transaction, he acts in accordance with the eternal laws of commodity exchange. In fact, the seller of the labor power, like the seller of any commodity, realizes its exchange value and alienates its use value. He cannot take one without giving the other. Use value of the labor power, in other words, belongs just as little to the seller as the use value of oil after it's been sold. The dealer sold it. The owner of the money has paid the value of a day's labor power, therefore has the use of it for a day. Labor belongs to him. On the one hand, daily sustenance of labor power costs only half a day's labor, while on the other hand, the very same labor power can remain effective, in other words, can work, during an entire day. Consequently, the value which its use during one day creates is double what the capitalist pays for the use. This circumstance is a piece of good luck for the buyer, but by no means an injustice towards the seller. And I think he uses injustice very intentionally there, because when I first read that, I was like, wait, Marx, what the fuck? Like, what do you mean it's not an injustice? I think it's sort of tongue-in-cheek, because we, and also Marx, know that the justice system is absolutely fucked and very much in the favor of capitalists. Because, after all, private property is 9/10 of the law, right? So, anyways, I think that's what he's getting at. But yeah, I highlighted basically the whole damn paragraph, because this is where he is really getting into the nitty gritty of like, okay, why is labor the one commodity that produces more value than it costs? And his simple answer is basically that, well, its exchange value is simply the cost it takes to reproduce it. But when you, quote unquote, use the labor power, in other words, labor is conducted, new labor is done, and therefore new value is created. That new value is not paid for at the beginning of the transaction. It only comes out after the labor has been done. And so the worker never really has a way of accounting for that. So they can't really negotiate, because they have the value they will eventually create hasn't been created yet, because their labor has not been their labor power has not been used till after the labor process is done. Okay, let's keep going. Again, this is I think there's only like two more paragraphs in succession that are I'm going to go almost all the way through because
Oh,
they're
it took me a second, but I think I found that Lenin quote you were looking for. I
okay,
put it in the
yeah.
chat.
I guess for the recording, in reality, it is not freedom of the press, but freedom for the rich, for the bourgeois, to deceive the oppressed, exploited mass of the people. So, yeah, it's more Lenin making fun of like liberal uh, civil rights, basically. Anyways, let's keep powering through here. Our capitalist foresaw this situation, and that was the cause of his laughter. The worker therefore finds in the workshop the means of production necessary for working not just 6 but 12 hours. Now he's going to do some more yarn math here. But to cut to the chase here, he says the sum of the values of the commodities thrown into the process amounts to 27 shillings. But the value of the yarn, meaning the final product, is 30 shillings. Therefore, the value of the product is 1/9 greater than the value advanced, and 27 shillings is turned into 30. The surplus value of 3 has been precipitated, and the trick has at last worked. Money has been transformed into capital. We have sort of finally arrived at our not conclusion, I guess but our first hypothesis. That's what I'm thinking of. So remember, I was talking about this a little bit before we started, but if we think of chapter 4, 5, and 6 as sort of Marx is sort of laying out the problem statement for capital, meaning the book. Well, part of it is also capital, like what the fuck is capital? But yeah, the problem statement is a little bit what is capital? What is surplus value? Where does surplus value come from? How does capital valorize itself? These are all kind of very interrelated and if not the same question. But in those 3 chapters, he was really laying out the question and also debunking a bunch of other explanations because Marx is very fond of debunking people. But now in chapter 7, we get the first part of his hypothesis. And the hypothesis is basically that surplus value is essentially labor that has not been paid for by the capitalist. And that is how the money that is made from selling a final product is somehow greater than the money that was started with. Therefore, that's why it becomes capital, because it is in a process of increase in quantity. Specifically by going into commodity exchange. And he does confirm here, or at least, he's saying that every condition of the problem is satisfied. Remember, that's what I'm talking about, the problem statement from earlier. It says every condition is satisfied. The laws of governing exchange value, the exchange of commodities has not been violated in any way. Equivalent has been exchanged for equivalent. But the capitalist, as a buyer, paid the full value for each commodity, for the cotton, for the spindle, and for the labor power. He then did what is done by every purchaser of commodities. He consumed their use values. The process of consuming labor power, which was also the process of producing commodities, resulted in 20 pounds of yarn, which is the value of 30 shillings. And now the capitalist is a buyer, or formerly a buyer, now returns as a seller, and he sells it that much money. But obviously he gets 3 more shillings than he started with. The whole course of events, the transformation of money into capital, both takes place and does not take place in the sphere of circulation. It takes place through the mediation of circulation because it is conditioned by the purchase of labor power in the market. It does not take place in circulation because what happens there is only an introduction to the valorization process, which is entirely confined to the sphere of production. And so everything is for the best in the best of all possible worlds. Okay, cool. Now, this one's good, actually. This is sort of a conclusion paragraph a little bit. This is by turning his money into commodities, remember that's M to C, which serve as the building materials for a new product and as factors in the labor process. By incorporating living labor into their lifeless objectivity, the capitalist simultaneously transforms value, which is past labor, in its objectified and lifeless form, into capital, value which can perform its own valorization process, an animated monster which begins to quote unquote work, as if its body were by love possessed. So kind of a nice callback to our intermediate reading of Capital is a Real God. We get this haunting imagery as Capital is an animated monster. And does anyone know when Frankenstein was published by Mary Shelley?
I'll have a date in a second.
Because I'm curious if this is a reference to Frankenstein or not.
1818.
Okay, so it very well could be.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Frankenstein's monster is an infamous animated monster.
Shit, I didn't realize it was 205 years old at this point.
Yeah, it's
obviously
kind of
yeah, I was gonna say obviously the last part here is he's referencing, how do you even say that, Goth or something? I don't know if it has some bizarre fucking French ass pronunciation or something, but
It's actually I think it's German.
I still blame the French for everything. It's fine.
Gotha?
Is it Gotha?
Yeah.
Okay.
I don't know, but if it's German, the TH is usually just T.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. That's always how I've heard it pronounced.
Got it.
Yeah, and yeah, because it's Auerbach's cellar in Leipzig. I'm pretty sure that's German.
Makes sense. So to wrap up the production process, he says, considered as the unity of the labor process, part 1 of the chapter, and the process of creating value, is the process of production of the commodities. And consider it as a unity of the labor process and the process of valorization. It is the capitalist process of production or the capitalist form of production of commodities. So he's sort of concluding this chapter by saying that this unity of opposite processes going on, that of producing commodities and then valorizing the value that is created by them, created in the labor process, I should say, is sort of the fundamental clockwork of the capitalist form of production. Because, and I think the reason that he's basically saying that they're a bit contradictory, right, in the sense of the unity of opposites, is that the labor process is something that human beings have been doing for generations and will probably continue to do for generations because we need use values. We do labor in order to make useful things. And the capitalist mode of production has added this extra dimension to it called valorization of capital, meaning, or just, I guess, the valorization process in short, otherwise known as the social relation called capital, where it's all about exchange value. We're trying to get more value than we started with, and that is in a lot of ways contradictory to the labor process of producing use values, even though use values sort of make exchange value, like exchange itself, possible. So this sort of like weird unity of these two conflicting processes is sort of like the underpinning of the entire form of production. And indeed, we'll probably see later in the text how these two aspects are constantly in conflict, contradiction with one another. And we'll kind of probably see it more in chapter 10, so this will be next week, that this is also the basis along which class lines are basically drawn, where you've got one class is all concerned with using the labor process in order to valorize capital, and the other class is engaging with the labor process in order to get not valorize capital, even though that's what they end up doing, but basically just in order to survive, because they don't have any other ways of surviving other than working. So, anyways, yeah, that's kind of one of the underpinnings of one of the main contradictions within capitalism. And then I guess this last part is it's a short little part where he's talking about the average social quality being simple labor. I do think the analogy here what he's basically saying that like complex labor is labor with a higher specific gravity. So I guess I don't know if this counter argument is even like common anymore. I'm sure it crops up from time to time, but the whole idea of like, it's weird that he includes this quick, rapid debunk like right at the end of the chapter. It's kind of weird, but he's just quickly saying that like complex labor is basically just a multiple of simple labor, I guess is the simplest way of putting it. Just like how specific gravity is another way of writing density for like fluids and substances and stuff, as a multiple of the density of water. So that's all it means. So if the density of water is very close to 1,000 kilograms per meter cubed, then the specific gravity is just density divided by the density of water. It just turns it in from an absolute value into a ratio. So the specific gravity of water therefore would be 1, and everything else can be it's just a multiple of 1. Obviously anything times 1 is the thing that you multiply it by. So that's all he's saying, right? Is it like, yeah, I can say complex labor of, I don't know, being a doctor or something is just a bunch of little simple labors multiplied by a large number. It takes longer to train to be a doctor, I guess. It's I don't know why he includes it at the end of the chapter. He also has this monster of a footnote about it. So I guess
he kind of brings it up. He kind of brings it up earlier in the chapter and says, "I'll get back to that later." And so this is him getting back to it later. But like he's doing a couple of things here. One of it is basically saying that one of them is essentially saying that it doesn't really matter whether it's like simple labor or more complex labor. In the end, the same proportion of surplus value is being stolen from the laborer. And he's also using it in that kind of monster of a footnote. And I cannot believe he buries this in a footnote unless he gets to it more in depth elsewhere, to address the sort of false distinction between skilled labor and unskilled labor, which is still something that we battle with today as a sort of excuse to pay certain jobs less money that still require a significant amount of work and arguably a significant amount of skill.
Two words come to mind in this mess: essential worker.
Yeah, I mean that, as well as you'll refer to say working in fast food or working in agriculture as unskilled labor, and like if you've ever like been on like a farm and seen the way that like certain things have to be harvested by hand in a very specific way, at a very specific pace, like there's no way that you could call that unskilled. That requires a skill that has to be trained and learned and perfected at just as much as a surgeon wielding a scalpel. So he kind of buries a lot of that in the footnote, and he doesn't, I don't think, directly mention it, but I think that Harvey had mentioned that in 19th century France, that any job that a woman could do, it was automatically classified as unskilled and therefore was paid less. And this resulted in a lot of labor unions not wanting women to be allowed to do their jobs because it would suppress their wages. So there's also a subtext to a lot of this, that the division and the distinction between skilled labor and unskilled labor, or higher and simple labor, is to divide the working class, to divide the proletariat in such a way that they are acting against each other rather than against the capitalists.
Yeah, actually, I forgot that Harvey brought that up as like one of the main points of contention in the First International.
Yes.
So, yeah, definitely.
There's a lot
it's obviously like
into that footnote.
I was gonna say it's obviously like an important section. I was just baffled why he put it at the end, seemingly after the conclusion.
No, I mean, it really does almost seem like an afterthought, like, oh yeah, I meant to get back to this.
Yeah, I don't know why he just didn't address it during the
Marx,
labor.
get a better letter.
Yeah, it's like this seems like it should have been in the labor process section because it's literally about the labor process.
Yeah. So like, maybe he talks about it more later. I don't know.
Yeah. I don't know if he needs to say that much more about it. I mean, on one hand, he does say, right, that like on one hand it does simplify the analysis, so it's very convenient for Marx. But like he does, like you just said, he gets into the nitty gritty of it, like in the footnote, almost more by saying like, yeah, this, if we're just talking about, what is the line, what is like the party line that we should go for in terms of like distinction? Is it even worth having a distinction between complex labor and simple labor, or unskilled and skilled? And his answer is basically no. That's dumb because like it doesn't make the analysis simpler, so that's lame. But also, like you just said, it's unnecessarily drawing lines where there doesn't need to be any. So what's the point? It's almost reminds me of like the Engels conclusion of On Authority, right? Where he's like, either you're confusing everyone, which is annoying, or you're just a reactionary, which is really annoying. So just shut up and stop it. That's, in some ways, that seems like what Marx is going for here.
See that. But yeah, I mean, but I am with you. I'm kind of like, I'm a little baffled that he just sort of, it felt like an afterthought, and that just like, what amounts to an absurd amount of analysis just gets crammed in a footnote.
Yeah, there's a couple footnotes that are like heavy hitters or have funny jokes in them that probably could have made the main draft.
Oh yeah, or just some absolutely sick burns.
Definitely.
A little bit more revision wouldn't have hurt.
Definitely not. All right, chapter 8, constant and variable capital. So, like I said, well, actually, let's at least go through the intro really quickly just to figure out what he's talking about here. All All right, so he's going to say, there's different parts of labor process going on here. So the worker adds fresh value to the material of his labor by expending on it a given amount of additional labor, no matter what the specific content, purpose, and technical character of that labor may be. But on the other hand, the values of the means of production used up in the process are preserved and present themselves afresh as constituent parts of the value of the new product. The values of the cotton and the spindle, for instance, reappear again in the value of the yarn. The value of the means of production is therefore preserved by being transferred to the product. This transfer takes place during the conversion of those means into a product, and in other words, during the labor process. Is it mediated through labor? It is mediated through labor, but how is this done? I don't want to yada yada too much. I will skip a bit ahead here. But he's laying out what he wants to cover with this chapter, which it's a chapter that's very much just laying out the definitions for constant capital and variable capital. But let's jump to here. He says, by the simple addition of a certain quantity of labor, new value is added. And by the quantity of this added labor, the original values of the means of production are preserved in the product. This twofold effect, resulting from the twofold character of labor, appears quite plainly in numerous phenomena. So he's laying out that it's pretty easy to observe that when you start with a pile of means of production, it could be tools, raw material, both, whatever. When labor acts on that to make something new, the values of the original stuff used to make the thing, meaning the value of the tool and the value of the raw materials, gets transferred into the new product. And that only happens during the labor process. Which he's basically saying that is one of the things that labor can achieve. Labor can not only, like he says in the beginning, add new value to the final product, but it also transfers value from the original components into the final product. Now, if we think about it, and I think Harvey mentions this in the video, I'm almost positive nobody in history has ever been paid on the basis of transferring value from, components into the final product. That is almost entirely unaccounted for in terms of paying people for their work. But Marx is saying, hey, it happens whether the worker knows it or not, whether the capitalist is aware of it or not. Although I think he hints at they probably do know that, and they just don't give a fuck and won't pay for it because why do they don't need to. But I think David Harvey's hinting at this, and Marx is hinting at this too, that we're already hemming and hawing about how much unpaid labor is going on as a way of generating surplus value. But the service that is done by labor just to advance value from point A to point B is almost entirely uncompensated. So the amount that labor is being underpaid or undercompensated could, if you interpret it that way, could be just orders of magnitude more than we realize. So definitely an interesting implication. I guess we'll see if Marx really dives into that later on. I'd be curious if he does, but he's at least laying the groundwork for that, or making that observation. Okay, let's go a little more here. Let's start right here. The reason why means of production do not lose their value at the same time as they lose their use value is that they lose in the labor process the original form of their use value, only to assume it in the product the form of a new use value. But however important it may be to value that it should have some use value to exist in, it is still a matter of complete indifference what particular object serves this purpose. We saw this when dealing with the metamorphosis of commodities. So, recall that a value or an exchange value needs a use value as its material body. It needs to have, because remember, exchange value or / value is a social relation. Therefore, it is immaterial, but objective. But in order to have a material basis, something that humans can actually like fucking identify as a real thing, it needs to have a use value, which is the material aspect of the commodity. But what Marx is saying here is that all it needs is some use value. What exactly it is, the particular form it takes, doesn't really matter. If I have like lumber has all kinds of use values. But it doesn't matter what the use values are. I could use lumber to make chairs, tables, fucking doors, plywood, studs, whatever. All kinds of shit gets made out of wood. As long as it has some use, that's fine. The value is still, at the end of the day, the amount of socially necessary labor time it took to get the wood. That's all that matters as far as value is concerned. The other concern is that it has to have some use value. What it is, what the particular use is, doesn't matter. Just that it has one. And he's saying that applies, and he says that metamorphosis of commodities, that's another way of saying the exchange of commodities, right? Where we're, or like the CMC circuit. He says like we've already seen this, right? We've already seen how value can be preserved even though the use value is changing between the exchange of commodities. So yeah, he's already laid the groundwork for it. So he's just using the exact same conclusion here to basically say, yeah, value is preserved when you use a group of values to make a new thing, a new product that retains those values. Okay, let's keep skimming ahead here. Let's go right here. It is thus strikingly clear that the means of production never transfer more value to the product than they themselves lose during the labor process by the destruction of their own use value. If an instrument of production has no value to lose, i.e., it is not the product of human labor, it transfers no value to the product. It helps to create use value without contributing to the formation of exchange value. This is true of all those means of production supplied by nature without human assistance, such as land, wind, water, metals, in the form of ore, and timber and virgin forests. Although I would add the slight caveat that you still need to go get the ore and you need to go get the timber. So, even though it is out there, at the very least, someone has to go get it and bring it to where it is needed. But anyways, yeah, it's another, similar to the last section I just highlighted. It's kind of like another way of, almost reminds me of like the first law of thermodynamics, right? Like energy cannot be created nor destroyed. As long as we're talking about, the use of commodity. In terms of using stuff, using a commodity cannot, other than labor power. I guess the big asterisk on this paragraph is, actually, he's clear by using means of production, which is distinct from labor. So basically saying everything that is not labor power cannot produce more value than they have to start with. So in some ways it's a little bit of a debunking of like the potential counter argument by saying, oh, well, like if I make a really badass machine that produces like a shit ton of products for, you know, and there's barely any labor produced, like, you know, that would be awesome. And that might be the case, but Marx is saying that's not where the value is coming from ultimately. You just have, I mean, the real answer for like technology stuff, to, even though we will get it, I know, I'm almost positive we will get into this later because I know Marx talks about it at some length, but yeah, the reason you get a competitive advantage when you, for example, increase your productive capacity with like new technology or something is because the rest, remember that you sell things according to their socially necessary labor time, which is the social average. It's the average amount of time it takes to make something. So if all of your competitors take a whole day to make a product, and so do you at first, but then you invent a new machine that allows you to make, you know, 10 per day. Okay, so like right away, you're going to have an immediate advantage because you're going to be producing 10 times more products, but the average amount of time it takes is still closer to what your competitors are doing. So you're basically selling things at your competitors' prices, but you're selling way, way more of them, which allows people to undercut the prices. When you suddenly have a huge increase in production, you can justify cutting your prices below that of your competitors. But eventually, your competitors are either going to get bought out by the most productive capital, and therefore they won't be competitors anymore, or they will successfully compete and mimic the same technology in order to match that production. And then it's basically like the value will readjust. It'll return back to the average. Right? And again, I think of this kind of in terms of the negative feedback loop from a few meetings ago, right? Where, I mean, think of it like the thermostat analogy, right? You know, if your thermostat is set to like 72, but you accidentally leave your freaking oven on at 500 and you leave the door open for some stupid reason and the temperature suddenly, you know, spikes, the control system's going to respond by lowering the temperature. That's pretty much what happens in the market too, right? If you have a rapid increase in productive capacity, then eventually the prices are going to drop. But you might have a brief window of competitive advantage. So anyways, I know I'm almost positive we'll get into this much more later on. But the basis of that argument is really in some of these earlier chapters where Marx is laying the groundwork by saying, you know, the value of the products the surplus value that gets valorized from selling commodities does not come from like machinery. It comes from human labor. Okay. Got that. Let's keep going forward here. Okay, here. While productive labor is changing the means of production into constituent elements of a new product, their value undergoes a metempsychosis. I'm not sure what that word means. I didn't even look it up earlier. It deserts the consumed body to occupy the newly created one. This transmigration takes place, as it were, behind the back of the actual labor in progress. So it's another way of saying that the worker may not be totally conscious of this happening, basically. The worker is unable to add new labor or to create new value without at the same time preserving the old values, because the labor he adds must be of a specific useful kind, and he cannot do work of a useful kind without employing products as the means of production of a new product, and thereby transferring their value to the new one. I guess it's not that much different from what we've gone over already. So think of that as maybe a little bit of a summary. Oh, I guess the end of this paragraph is actually pretty good too. I'll just keep going. The property, therefore, which labor power in action, aka living labor, possesses of preserving value at the same time as it adds it, is a gift of nature, which costs the worker nothing, but it's very advantageous to the capitalist, since it preserves the existing value of his capital. As long as trade is good, the capitalist is too absorbed in making profits to take notice of this gratuitous gift of labor. However, violent interruptions in the labor process, crises, make him painfully aware of it. So I guess I gave this away a little earlier, but about how like the capitalist doesn't really give a shit about this aspect of the labor process until it starts hurting the bottom line. So if you haven't, like he says, interruptions in the labor process, maybe I don't know, a strike potentially, or sort of collective action on the part of the workers, suddenly all these commodities that the capitalists bought that are supposed to be turned into new products are not being turned into new products. And, well, let's imagine they're not like, they're not inorganic. Maybe they're organic raw materials. So maybe, think of like food production, for example, right? The capitalists are constantly shipping in all kinds of food products from all over the world in order to make some processed food, right? Let's use this example. If those workers go on strike, all that food that's getting shipped in is not getting turned into processed food and will probably go to waste. And in that situation of an interrupted labor process, that's when the capitalist says, "Oh shit." All that money I spent to buy, all that initial capital that I was advancing just got flushed down the drain, and I am fucked. So yeah, interesting little passage there. Okay, now let me skip 317. So I guess this is the last part. I'll go maybe almost the last part I'll go into this chapter. This is like finally get to their definitions, right? So he says the part of capital, therefore, which is turned into the means of production, i.e. the raw material and the auxiliary material and the instruments of labor, does not go any quantitative alteration of value in the process of production. For this reason, I call it the constant part of capital or constant capital. On the other hand, the part of capital which is turned into labor power does undergo an alteration of value in the process of production. It both reproduces the equivalent of its own value and it produces an excess, which we call surplus value, which may itself vary and be more or less according to circumstances, the material conditions. This part of capital is continually being transformed from a constant into a variable magnitude. I therefore call it the variable part of capital or variable capital. The same elements of capital which, from the point of view of the labor process, can be distinguished respectively as the objective and subjective factors as means of production and labor power, can be distinguished from the point of view of the valorization process as constant and variable capital. So there you go. Those are the two types of capital that we're going to be using going forward. Simply, in the most brief way possible, if he wanted to make this entire chapter like one sentence, he would have just said, labor power is variable capital and constant capital is everything else. All the other means of production. There you go. Okay, I think I won't go through the whole summary paragraph, but like we've said multiple times before, the summary paragraphs are usually a nice way of wrapping things up. So, review that if you wish. If you need to refresh your memory at any time about, what's the difference between these two again, maybe jump back to this paragraph and refresh your memory. Okay. The rate of surplus value. Like I said, this is another chapter where I guess it's not super long, but it is rather wordy for what he's trying to get at. And by God, I was very frustrated at some of the values, like numerical values that he chose to use as examples. Because it's like, come on, man, you can't just pick round numbers, like, Jesus. Especially when he gets into the, where is it? All the fractions and shit. Where does he even start using fractions? Yeah. Fucking 7 3/4. Man, what the hell? Look at all this shit. Expanded fractions. It's so annoying. Okay. Anyways, so he's gonna start translating. Oh, go ahead.
Oh no, I was just joking. You're like expanded fractions, fucking hell, and I'm like, I found the scientist.
Yeah. Hell, I barely work with numbers to begin with. I let spreadsheets
you get to a certain point, and
I let spreadsheets do the math for me.
also, like, you get to a certain point, and it's basically all variables anyway.
Exactly. Yeah. I just have huge spreadsheets of data and let the graphing software do all the shit for me. All that math class is for nothing. It's all simple algebra at the end of the day, including this chapter. So, first thing that we set up here is what we just talked about in Chapter 8, is that our big C capital is just a combination of constant capital, which is little c. I don't know, maybe you could have done a better job with one of these symbols, making one of them not C. That would have been my editor's note. But little v is variable capital. And he says that once the process of production is finished, we get a commodity whose value is C plus V plus S, where S is surplus value. So you can see that when we go from, I guess another editing note from me, if you're going to use C and C prime for capital, then using C to CMC for like commodity is even more confusing, because like you're using the same symbol to mean capital and commodity. Probably shouldn't do that. That's from a technical writing perspective, but anyways. Yeah, basically. So if we want to figure out like the delta between these two, right, we do C prime minus C. Obviously, we get S, which is the surplus value. I don't know what madness drove him to use 90 and 410 as examples. I mean, there's no reason. You could have just done 2 plus 1 plus 1 or something. I don't know. So he does go through this a little bit. I don't know. A lot of this seemed like pretty basic algebra, I guess. Yeah. So I guess take a look at the math channel if anyone needs help with this chapter. I'm sure the math wizards in there can figure it out for you. But yeah, he says there's this part in here where he's talking about, like, you know, you can make constant capital 0 and, you know, nothing really changes because both terms have a C in them. This formula stays the same regardless of what C is. Like, that's fine. And then this other part, this is a good part to call out, I guess. That he says that from what has gone before, we know that surplus value is purely the result of an alteration in the value of V, of that part of capital which was converted into labor power. Consequently, V plus S could be also written as V plus delta V. Remember, delta means change in V. In this case, it's a positive change. But the fact is that it is V alone that varies, and the conditions of that variation are obscured by the circumstances that, in consequence of the increase in the variable component of capital, there's also an increase in the sum total of the capital advanced. So yeah, V is kind of causing the increase in value here. Okay. Let's cut to the ratio part. Where does he talk about that? Yeah, here we go. I guess we'll start here roughly. So this is the relative quantity produced, or the ratio in which the variable capital has valorized its value, is plainly determined by the ratio of the surplus value to the variable capital, which is S over V. In our example, this is 90 over 90, or 100%. This relative increase in the value of the variable capital, or the relative magnitude of the surplus value, is here called the rate of surplus value. So there you go. That's the name of the chapter. Should probably cover that before calling it quits. But yeah, he calls this the rate, and remember, he's basically says, like, we don't really care about C right now. Don't completely neglect C yet. I will definitely come back around at some point. But if we want to talk about the rate of surplus value, it's sort of, I'm trying to think about how to word this other than how he just worded it. Well, okay, he calls it the relative increase in the value of the variable capital. So I guess that's, in other words, of saying how much value did you get at the end of the labor process versus how much did you pay for it in the beginning. I think that's another way of putting it. Because remember, small v here is basically what did you pay, and S is basically what did you get out of it at the end. So in some ways, he calls it a rate, but again, to my STEM Lord brain, this reads a little bit more like a efficiency. So if anyone's familiar with like thermodynamics, right? Basically any efficiency is written as a ratio, so that, you know, that box checked. This is a simple ratio. But it pretty much any efficiency of like an engine or any thermodynamic process essentially is how much did you get out versus how much did you put in. That's essentially what a efficiency ratio means. That means if your engine or
whatever is like 50% efficient, then basically you are putting in twice as much energy as you are getting out of it. For example. So he calls it the rate, but like I said, it's in some ways I kind of think of it more of an efficiency. Like how efficient is your labor process? Like it's squeezing labor out of your workers. But obviously, if you're a capitalist, you're interpreting that in dollars instead of I don't know, a percentage. All right. Next important little bit here, and this is something to keep in mind for chapter 10 when we get there. He'll define the portion of the working day during which this reproduction takes place, necessary labor time. So I guess I skipped a little bit here, but okay, let's rewind just a second here. If instead of working for the capitalist, the worker worked independently on his own account, he would all other things being equal, still be obliged to work for the same number of hours in order to produce the value of his labor power. So basically, it's just another way of saying that like laborers need to work, or should be anybody needs to work at least a little bit every day in order to sustain themselves. So he's saying that like let's just pretend even if a worker wasn't working for a capitalist, they would still need to work some amount of time. Now, the amount of time that the worker needs to work in order to reproduce or sort of pay for their own existence is what he calls necessary labor time. It's sort of the minimum. The minimum necessary amount you need to put in order to justify being there in the first place. And therefore, he just says the labor done there times necessary labor. Okay, great. And he does say that it is necessary for the worker because independent of the particular social form of his labor, and is necessary for capital in the capitalist world because the continued existence of the worker is the basis of that world. Right? So we can say that at the very least, that not only in capitalism, but also other social forms, workers have to work at least enough to keep themselves alive. As the bare minimum. That's what he's calling necessary. Now he says that the second part of the labor process, where you're no longer doing necessary labor, except you're still expending labor power, you're still on the clock, but it's no longer necessary. He says this part of the day I call surplus labor time, and obviously the labor is called surplus labor. So this is basically just getting a little more granular from what we talked about earlier, that now we're getting to the point where we're saying, or where Marx is saying that we can chop up the clock, so to speak. How much time are you on the clock? Some portion of that time is necessary, and the other portion is surplus. So again, this is sort of laying some important groundwork for chapter 10, which is called the working day, and is, I think, the first foray into, really taking a closer look at like class struggle. And he's sort of laying the groundwork here, right? Because class struggle happens on many different fronts. We're struggling all the time against the capitalist class, on all kinds of different lines. But for now, the first line that he's going to look at is the working day. In other words, how much of our day is necessary versus how much is surplus. And basically what we'll get to is that at the conclusion essentially is that the workers always want to work fewer hours, because that means that their day is getting closer and closer to just necessary labor, and meaning less and less surplus labor, whereas the capitalist obviously wants the complete opposite. They want us to work as long as possible in order to extend that amount of time that it is purely surplus labor. So they want us to work well beyond what is necessary. And that ratio between the two is really like there's a lot of factors that go into it, but one of the major factors is class struggle. Right? What are the material conditions around class struggle? Is there organized labor? I mean, for the most part, the capitalist class is fairly well organized. I know they compete against each other for market share, but when it comes to class solidarity, unfortunately, capitalists are very good at aligning with each other on class lines. But anyways, yeah, kind of get into that. So anyways, he says, yeah, now that we've got this definition, we can interpret S over V as surplus labor over necessary labor. It's just another way of saying it. So again, it's sort of, like I said, it's reminds me of an efficiency formula, meaning if I'm the capitalist, how efficient is my labor process, is my working day? Because the surplus labor ultimately is what I'm looking for, right? I want surplus labor, I want surplus value, because that's ultimately what makes my capital grow. If I just did necessary labor, if my workers only did necessary labor and then left, my capital would never grow, right? They would only produce exactly as much value as I paid them, and therefore I would just keep breaking even every day. But that's not what I'm trying to do. If I'm the capitalist, if from the capitalist perspective, I want surplus labor to be greater than necessary labor. And so, if surplus labor is the thing I get out of this process, but necessary labor is the thing I must pay in order to make it happen, then that's basically just an efficiency, right? This is how much I'm looking to get out, this is how much I had to put in. Okay. Let's see. So I think, yeah, some more insane fractions that I don't give a shit about. That's seriously, man, editing. Let's see.
I was going to say, I kind of bottom lined all of, I'm going to say, the three major equations in this channel in the chat, but for the sake of the recording,
Yeah.
the three major things that are discussed are that productivity is constant capital divided by necessary labor. The rate of surplus value, or the rate of profit, is surplus labor divided by the sum of constant capital and necessary labor. And then you have the rate of exploitation, which is surplus labor divided by necessary labor, which was what we were just discussing. But what I found interesting when comparing the equations for the rate of profit and the rate of exploitation is that you can still be a highly exploited worker without the capitalist making much of a profit. And that's kind of particularly in this day and age of things like startups, is kind of a good thing to keep in mind, because reading this part reminded me of this time I was interviewing with a startup, and they wanted to pay me $8 an hour. And this was not that long ago. This was probably about 5 or 6 years ago. And what they essentially said to me is, yeah, we can't pay you a whole lot now because we're not making a whole lot of money, but we can offer you essentially equity in the company because we're looking to get bought out within 5 years. Which, I mean, that's a startup for you, but I basically would have been doing work that I, as a consultant, got paid 5 times as much for, because they weren't making a whole lot of profit, but I would have still been doing the same amount of work.
Yeah, that's definitely possible. And yeah, I do sympathize with the startup struggle. Yeah.
Yeah, that was kind of the example that entire ball of wax brought to mind.
Yeah. Okay, so I'll quickly breeze through Marx's debunking of the quote-unquote last hour argument from this guy Senior. Nassau Senior. It's very odd. So he was basically trying to argue that if the working day, let's say the working day starts as 12 hours, what they were getting at, what this dude suggested is that for the first 11 hours of the day, the worker is essentially doing necessary labor, I guess is one way of interpreting it, and that the entirety of the profit, meaning surplus labor, was done in the last hour of the 12-hour day. And that if the law at the time were to cut the hours from like 12, the minimum hours that workers should work, if they were to cut from like 12 to 11, then the 11th, like that hour, the 1 hour of day where profit is generated, gets eliminated, then no profit would be made and the economy would collapse. This is pretty obviously a ridiculous argument. And I think it's pretty transparent that the only reason this dude came up with this argument is so they wouldn't shorten the working day, which is pretty obvious. And Marx just kind of goes through this, pointing out how absurd it is. So yeah, it's just another section of Marx doing some fun debunking. So if you're into that, hopefully you enjoyed this.
You do run into those people who brag about working 80 plus hours a week, and you just kind of stare at them and go, I hope you enjoy your stroke in 15 years.
Yeah, I mean, part of me thinks that's not really... I don't think they actually believe this particular form of the
iteration
argument.
of it. I am aware. It is just a successor to that argument.
Yeah, I think it's just internalizing it's basically an internalizing capitalist ideology. And basically they've completely bought it hook, line, and sinker that like the unironic version of work will set you free.
Yeah, and considering the origins of that, it's one of those. Huh.
Yikes.
Very,
Little bit
very
that.
yikes.
Though,
Also,
despite
shout
the
out to
fact
this
that,
footnote that's over a page long.
yeah, the mother of all footnotes. Yeah, I was going to say, if you didn't point that out, I was going to.
There are
Though,
others in volume 2 and 3, just a warning.
It's not the
okay.
footnote, it's the leg note.
the whole thigh-high note. Um, the last hour argument, though absurd on its face, though, it does feel like the predecessor to a number of other arguments that have been made throughout history and that continue to be made against shortening the workday, or at this point, we're talking about like shortening the work week to 4 days, is kind of the big discussion now. And
Yep.
so instead of the last hour argument, we're starting to get that fifth day argument, which is essentially the exact same thing.
But why won't you think of the exploitative profits given to the billionaires? Ooh.
But the hilarity of it all is that in companies that have gone to a 4-day work week, or even in handfuls of cases,
They do
countries,
see
or
better work
they,
returns.
yeah, exactly, they actually do better. And I think historically that has happened every single time that the workday has been shortened, or that the work week went from 7 days to 6 days to 5 days. That you essentially see, an, if you will, a distillation of, of your, of
Honestly, I tend
yeah,
to take it as a adjustment for the insane level of skew between actual productivity, the ability to meaningfully produce goods and services, versus what capital wants out of the system, which is frankly everything.
no, absolutely. And I mean, and when you look at the fact that they've done studies on office workers, that in an 8-hour workday, most office workers are genuinely productive for a maximum of about 3 hours.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you can come to one of two extreme conclusions from that. One is, well, obviously we need to micromanage our workers more, which we started to see during the pandemic with electronic surveillance of, God, don't get me started.
Zoom calls.
You
You
got all
must have your
those-
laptop on 24/7
I
so we can
feel
see if you're pooping on the company dime.
I feel grateful every fucking day that I've never had to use Slack, but I feel so bad for people who have to.
I have to use
Oh.
Slack because it's part of the freaking org out here I volunteer for, and I hate it so much.
For things like Slack or Microsoft Teams or whatever, I don't have to use them for my current job, but one thing that I've learned in previous jobs is if you just always have your status set as away, just whether you're there or not.
I was gonna say I use Teams, but only as like the calendar, basically. But yeah, I get what you mean.
Yeah. So for anybody listening, life hack: always have your Slack or Teams status set to away, and it solves a lot of your problems.
Yep. I'll just throw out this quick debunk. Basically, Marx gets around to saying, well, he's basically like, well, by your logic, if you extend the working day by an hour and a half, then your profit goes from 100% to 200%. Which obviously does not happen. So, anyways, there's a lot of reasons it's a totally bunk argument, but it's silly. So anyways, the last part here is he calls it, he says the portion of the product that represents the surplus value we call the portion of the product surplus product, just as the rate of surplus value is determined by its relation, not to the sum total of the capital, but it's to its variable part. In the same way, the relative amount of the surplus product is determined by its ratio, not to the remaining part of the total product, to that part in which is necessary labor incorporated. Okay. Not such a big deal there. And then to conclude this chapter, he says the sum of the necessary labor and the surplus labor, which is the sum of the periods of time during which the worker respectively replaces the value of his labor power and then produces the surplus value, constitutes the absolute extent of his labor time, i.e. the working day. Which leads us into chapter 10, where we will get to next week. And
We'll be here a while because it's fun.
yeah, it's a very, very good chapter. Shout out to our vampiric sucky boys. So yeah, very good chapter. Like I said, it's sort of like, if you're just looking at it from like a scientific method perspective, this is sort of like the beginning of the evidence. So he's defined his terms in the first 3 chapters, and then he gives the problem statement in the next 3, in the chapters 4 through 6, and then the chapters we just went over, he sort of lays out his hypotheses. Not all of them, but at least this group of hypotheses. And now we're getting to the evidence. Obviously, remember, this is social science, not physical science. So instead of experiments, you look at historical data, you look at social statistics, and
you get to do everybody's favorite data analysis.
It is a lot of, data analysis is happens in pretty much any scientific endeavor, but in social science, you sort of just cut straight to the data analysis, more or less.
Yeah.
I know
Sometimes you
a lot
gather
of
the
social
data
scientists
yourself,
do.
but-
Yeah, sometimes they collect it himself. In Marx's case, he did not collect it himself.
Yeah, but yeah, a lot of the times you go find somebody else's data and do new and interesting things to it.
Yeah, correct. So yeah, that's what we got to look forward to. And like I said, it's also where we really start diving headfirst into class struggle, which is pretty cool. So yeah,